The French are quite willing to game the system.
They're unable to deliver the radical change that they had promised voters.
They almost imploded shortly before the elections.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. Wow, the Brexit referendum feels a long time ago today. Remember all those nice left-leaning activists hanging the EU flag out of their windows, traumatised about being stuck on right-wing Brexit Island, applying for Irish passports in their droves to have access to the open-minded, progressive continentals? Well, history likes to have a laugh at our expense. And as the results of the latest European elections have been coming in over the past 2 days, halfway through our own general election here in the UK, what is pretty clear is that just as the UK looks like it's going to turn a rather uninspiring soft left, Europe is turning right. In some cases, dramatically so. Let's be more specific. Looking at the overall results, the left group in the European Parliament is down just 1. Socialists and Democrat group down 2. The Greens down 20, so it's been a terrible few days for the Green groups across Europe, and we want to talk about exactly why that has happened. And Renew, which is what they call the basically centrist Blairite sort of group, they are down 23 seats. So it's been a terrible round of elections for the centrists and the Greens. Meanwhile, the centre-right European People's Party, the EPP group, is +9 in the European Parliament. The Conservatives and Reformists group, which is basically a more right-wing group, are +4. The Identity and Democracy group, which, for example, includes Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, is up 9. They had an incredibly successful night. So under these headline results, it's a real fascinating mix, and I think it's worth trying to understand what is actually going on in Europe. Parts of Europe are actually getting less populist. So Poland, for example, which has been known for a very conservative government, is continuing its turn away from the right towards Donald Tusk's more centrist politics. He had a great night last night, and Scandinavia, including Sweden, of course, has also not seen a breakthrough from populist right parties. The Sverigedemokraterna, the Swedish Democrats, came 4th, and so right populism in Scandinavia can also be said to be in retreat. Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, again, they're not interested right now in populism. So it's a different mix across the continent. But what is definitely true, and the thing that matters most and that we need to focus on, is that the most powerful countries in Europe, Germany, France, Italy, have all seen a very dramatic rightward tilt. So Giorgia Meloni, for example, continues her grip on power. She had a very successful election. And Germany, the ruling coalition parties all received a drubbing, and the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, which is the populist right party, did much better than expected. Meanwhile, in Austria, just next door, the Freedom Party, which really is a radical party, which was born mainly during the lockdowns as a protest against some of those measures, came first in all of the nation's parties. Most eye-popping of all, of course, which you may have seen already, is that France, Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, has led the entire country, and I believe she got 37% of the vote, which is almost twice as much as the ruling party, or the party of President Macron, which is called En Marche. Let's try to get to the bottom of what's really happening here. We've brought together experts and UnHerd commentators from across the continent to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and hopefully by the end you will have a sense of what is really happening. Since the biggest story coming out of the last day is that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has dissolved the parliament in response to the European elections, in which Marine Le Pen, the radical right leader, if we call her that, was most successful and beat him. Let's start there. We're joined by Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, a favourite contributor of ours, a great writer and analyst of French politics. Welcome, Anne-Elisabeth. What's your version? Why did the president do this, and what does it mean for French politics?
The president did that because he is Emmanuel Macron and he's really a strange character, to be entirely honest. It's known as the nuclear option in France. Everybody is saying it's the nuclear options. There have been memes of him fiddling while Rome burnt as well. He's got 3 years to make Jordan Bardella look stupid, and I think that is his plan. His plan is to show that the National Rally cannot really govern, that they're not prepared for this, which is why he did this so fast.
This character, Jordan Bardella, who you just mentioned, who's he?
Jordan Bardella is the boy wonder of the National Rally. He is a young man who joined the National Rally at age 16. He lived in the Seine-Saint-Denis, which is the poorest département of France, with a majority of multicultural groups. And he decided that his thing was the National Rally, and he is extremely bright. I'm not even sure he got his baccalaureate, and he certainly didn't go to university. And he's got a brain, he's got an extremely nimble brain, and he has become the great sort of young new thing at the National Rally. And he's got great poise. He manages to sort of debate with one of Macron's interchangeable technocrats and not lose his footing. And he was the leader of the European list, and Marine Le Pen is preparing for the 2027 presidential election.
So he's 28, this guy, and he is technically leader then of the National Rally Party?
He's the president of the National Rally Party.
Right, and he could, in a small number of weeks, be Prime Minister of France.
She has said that she wasn't interested in becoming prime minister, but Jordan Bardella would do it very well. And Macron wants to prove that he can't do it very well, and there's historical precedent to this. A long time ago, François Mitterrand in 1986, he'd been elected in 1981. He was the first socialist president of France in 23 years, and he decided that he could deal with a prime minister from the party that had won the legislative elections, which are separate from the presidential elections in France, and that was one Jacques Chirac. And so Jacques Chirac became François Mitterrand's prime minister and suffered terribly for 2 years as the old wily Mitterrand ran rings around him and eventually won the presidential election of 1988, 2 years later. And Macron cannot run again, but he certainly thinks that he can do a Mitterrand on Jordan Bardella, who he thinks is not quite as good as Chirac. I think, like many things with Emmanuel Macron, it sounds good on paper and it blows in your face in reality. We'll see how that goes.
Big picture, that's the kind of political machinations in France. But big picture, what does it say to you about what the people of France are feeling and voting for? What are the policies that the National Rally are talking about that are proving popular?
The National Rally are doing pretty much a Farage at this stage. The only difference is that they want more state intervention rather than less. But they're talking about immigration, they're talking about law and order, they're talking about the danger of a hard left that has become anti-Semite. They also say, look, we've tried everyone and it didn't work, and we are new, we're working hard, we got where we are, and vote for us. And that finds many people to vote for them, as we've just seen yesterday.
It's interesting that you mentioned that point about state intervention, state spending, because actually the Farage version of the right-wing party is a kind of Thatcherite party. He wants a small state, he wants lower taxes, whilst the Le Pen-Bardella version is more of a sort of left version. Is that right? They want a big, traditional populist kind of state.
They are, and I don't want to infer too many things out of this, but yes, they are nationalist socialist. They believe in state intervention. They believe in, until recently, they believed in bringing back pension age to 60 when it went up to 65, and every single age shaven off from that took years to win in long protracted tugs of war between the government and the unions. They believe in giving more benefits, but only to French citizens and not foreigners on French soil. And they believe in the power of the state. They have a sort of hazy and romantic view of the French state as it was in the 30 years after the occupation, when France was rebuilding itself and the growth was 5% a year, but those years are gone.
In terms of extreme, I mean, you used that word. Nothing so far sounds that extreme about what they're saying. I mean, what are their most extreme policies? As I understand it, they don't even want to leave the European Union. Not that is essentially an extreme policy either, but where's the extreme bit in the Le Pen group?
The extreme bit mostly is on immigration, and the view is there are a number of things that the French will not take, and there are a number of things that are now on the table. What the French will not take, for instance, is leaving the European Union and even the euro. And whenever somebody says Frexit, immediately you've got 5 people of various political stripes who will all say, look at the British, and it did not help them. And you may think that this is a dream. I think it's a much more nuanced situation, but that's the way you sell it to the French, and it works. So it's a political reality. And they don't want to leave the euro. They wanted to leave NATO, but now they say they just want to leave the integrated command of NATO, but they will not be good NATO allies. They'll be more like Viktor Orban, for instance, and they'll be sort of certainly more attracted to Putin, who twice financed the presidential campaigns of Marine Le Pen, because she took loans from Russian banks, even though she's now repaid.
So their policy on Ukraine is somewhat closer to Orban then, that
yes.
She's more skeptical of the Western approach in Ukraine.
Yes, and they tap on a very long existing French anti-liberal, anti-Western, anti-American streak, and in some ways it goes back at over a century, and that's something that's deep-seated in this country, and you can tap on it. So that's one point. The other one is, of course, that they haven't exactly said what the solutions were, but they definitely want to do something which is a big it's an open question now whether the French will take it or not. They want to apply what we call national preference. It means that you have a preference for jobs, you have a preference for benefits, you have a preference for a number of things if you are French, born of French parents.
And is that even legal within the European Union?
That's an interesting question, but they are quite willing to sort of have a fight over this.
Interesting. So things like freedom of movement, which is this incredibly controversial part of the European Constitution, that everyone inside Europe can move around without checks at the borders. She's not against that. She doesn't want to reimpose a harder border.
France has always had, 3,500 kilometers of land borders. People get in. We've always known that people get in. It's it's not the controls that are so much stopping people. It would be patrols, and it would be patrols of as we actually have had since 2015, except they're called customs, between France and Italy, 2 countries that both signed up to Schengen, and yet when too many immigrants were coming from Italy, they were stopped by customs people who said you're not legal and you're not regular vis-a-vis customs, and so you can't really come into France. So the French are quite willing to game the system.
Right, so they're sort of ready to break the rules even though they've signed up to them. Quite a lot of countries in Europe seem to do that. Final question for you, Anne-Elisabeth. Give us the bigger picture here, because obviously since October the 7th, France has a very substantial Jewish population. It also has a very substantial Muslim population. That has been, and it sits on already a fertile ground for division. We know there have been terrorist attacks. It's been a big part of French politics for many years. What's the current state of that tension in France, and how much is that behind Le Pen's rise?
At its highest, the Jewish population in France was 700,000. It is now down to a little over 400,000. They have left because in the past 2-3 decades, their lives have become dangerous. And that is really, and everybody said, no, but it's just a few. And you add a few and more than a few, and people vote with their feet. And you've got about 10 times as much people of Muslim origin or who are practicing Muslims. And that's very different, actually, because the majority of Muslims in France are perfectly sort of law-abiding and not very aggressive. But it doesn't take that much to create chaos in some areas of of the country, and we're talking about anti-Semitic aggressions, but you have aggressions against other people in France, because once you start, kidnapping people and torturing them and killing them, and I'm referring to a specific murder, and it has happened again, you start doing it to everyone. And so the problem is seen as being very different. The Jews do not kidnap the Arabs in France and put them in cellars and torture them.
The whole kind of founding concept of French secularism, which is such the important principle of French society, is kind of on the ballot paper now, isn't it? Is there still hope that through having secular education, through having this society that's organised on secular principles, all these different groups can get along? Or are the people who are voting for Le Pen beginning to say, this isn't working, we need to try something different?
No. There's a promise by the Republic that the apparatus of the state will be neutral, that you have freedom of religion, freedom to believe something, freedom not to believe something, freedom to blaspheme, which has become almost impossible now in public because it is too dangerous. And I'm afraid that comes from only one community. The fear. And the fact that, for instance, you cannot publish the cartoons, the Mohammed cartoons that were published in Charlie Hebdo. We've got Chinese communities, we've got Vietnamese communities, we've got, the communities from the Eastern Europe, and none of this was a problem. We have a problem with radical Islam. Radical Islam has made inroads in a large Muslim population, most of which is completely peaceful, and very often, when they are good parents who want their children to succeed in life, they put their children in Catholic schools because they want the kids to have the best tuition possible. And I'm thinking of several examples around me. And then you've got inroads by radical Islam. The number of the Muslim Brotherhood, of people who belong to the Muslim Brotherhood in France has been given as over 100,000 by the expert Florence Bergeau-Blaclair, who's now protected by police because she's written a book about the inroads of the Muslim Brotherhood in France in the past 20 years.
And what is Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardela's solution to this? I mean, if they are successful in the parliamentary elections and it follows on with a presidential victory in 3 years' time, what is going to happen? What is their policy towards that issue?
I have no idea whether they have a sort of working policy on this. It is an extremely difficult thing to look at, but I've not heard anything from them that sounded like they had a solution. They have a frame of mind, and they say people will not tell you that such and such a crime was an anti-Semitic murder, even when somebody kills an old lady shouting dirty Jewess or throws another one across a window. And that very obviously was anti-Semitic, and for years it was even impossible to call this like that. And they say they will certainly change the way they look at those things, and they will stop saying in order not to stir more trouble, we're not going to talk about the trouble. And that's something that's the one thing that the Front National, and I call them Front National still, which is a problem for them, but that's something that the National Rally has made clear. Do they have solutions? Quite frankly, I'm not sure they have solutions.
Before we let you go, I know you're a bit of an expert on Hungary, and that's also had quite an interesting result because it appears to have gone the other way. The ruling Fidesz party, which is the party of Viktor Orban, who is almost the sort of definitive populist success story in Europe, has had a terrible election. And instead, this new party led by Peter Magyar, who was a member of Fidesz, has had a huge success. What's been going on there, and what do you think it means?
I think anybody who's on their third term, there's a moment when people get slightly tired of it. But I won't say that Orban did not do well, because he did 42% of the vote, and you've got small parties, and then you've got this new party called Tiska, led by the ex-husband of Orban's ex-justice minister, Judith Varga. And Peter Magyar left Fidesz. He was very angry, and he's now campaigning, and he got 30% with a party that's not even 6 months old. So that's pretty impressive.
And how does he differ from Orban? Is he considered more sort of centre-right? I see that his party, I think, is technically being grouped in the EPP, the European People's Party in Europe, which seems to indicate it's a bit more of a moderate party. Is that right?
Yes, well, Fidesz was in the EPP, and eventually they were pushed out by the EPP, and they want to join the ECR, and we'll see how that goes. And Giorgia, of course, everybody now wants to join the ECR, so does Marine Le Pen, because it's Giorgia Meloni, and she's the great success story of conservative politics in Europe. But in terms of Hungary, I think it was interesting to get someone like Peter Magyar, who doesn't say things so different from Fidesz, but probably wants a better relationship with the EU and might be less sympathetic to Russia and certainly is anti-corruption. And that would be enough for people to say, look, I liked what I used to vote for Orban about because that's what I believe. I haven't really changed my beliefs. I didn't like the opposition because they really were ineffectual and we had them before. And some of them were former communists and we don't like them. And now they're getting an alternative, and they're getting an alternative who's sort of talking a language that they like within parameters that they think are going to be better.
Fascinating. Anne-Elisabeth, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So from France, let's go to another of the great European powers, Italy. Now, this is a country that's actually had a populist leader, or at least a nominally populist leader, for some time in Giorgia Meloni. Thomas Fazi, what's your opinion of her and how successful was she in the past couple of days?
Well, she's clearly been very successful. These elections have confirmed that she still enjoys a strong popular support. In Italy, she's she's won what could be seen as a landslide victory, with the second largest party, the centre-left Democratic Party, the PD, quite far behind in the votes.
I just want to add, Thomas, that she scored 28.8% of the vote. So she was the largest party, but still, compared to some countries with fewer political parties, it's still nothing like an overall majority.
No, of course not. But I can't remember when was the last time we had a party that had an overall majority in any election in Italy. So this is, for any party to get 30% of the votes in Italy is a very big result. It's there's actually few precedents for that in our country's post-war history. So it's a very good result.
And why? Why do you think she's had such a successful result? What's the explanation for how she retained popularity?
As you know, and as readers of mine know, I've been very critical of Meloni, not from a left perspective, but more from a populist perspective. I've often criticized what I've seen as her backtracking on a lot of her formerly populist positions when it came to the European Union or to NATO, or she's adopted, in fact, very pro-establishment and very mainstream positions on a number of crucial issues. So she's probably the most mainstream populist in Europe at the moment, if we can still call her a populist. I mean, she's cozied up to von der Leyen. We know we have a great relationship, and in fact, she was still considering openly supporting von der Leyen for a second term. Now there's no need for her votes anymore, so she's gotten out of that pickle. But so, a pretty unusual populist, or at least a very mainstream populist. But I think that has to do with the constraints that governments are forced to operate within the euro. So it's not entirely a question of her betraying her ideals, more a question of just the structural constraints that governments operate under in the euro.
Do you think it provides a model for other populist leaders? Because we had this big result, everyone was terrified, the establishment thought, oh my god, her party, the Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy, is descended from a fascist party, what's she going to do? And actually, as you say, although there's been a few sort of right-wing striking policies around families and things, generally it's a pretty straightforwardly centre-right government that she's led, and as you say, very much within the European establishment. Should we now think that's what Marine Le Pen will do and everyone else?
Well, I think there's good reason to fear or hope for that, depending on one's perspective. I'm sure a lot of people in the kind of liberal centrist establishment are hoping for that. People that come from a more populist perspective, as we do, may have just as much good reason to fear that. And I think when we look at Le Pen's policies, or Le Pen's positions, I think we can already see a kind of creeping process of Melonification on her behalf. She's already seriously softened up her positions when it comes to the euro. She's effectively abandoned what was an anti-euro platform to adopt a euro reformist platform. We know that she looked upon quite favorably on relations with Russia and was quite critical of NATO's Ukraine intervention in Ukraine at first, and now she's slowly moved towards a more pro-war, pro-establishment position on that issue as well.
What about on the topic of immigration? Because that is so much at the heart of these campaigns, both Meloni's original success, but also Marine Le Pen now. How successful has Giorgia Meloni been at reducing immigration in Italy? Because that was part of her platform. Not very
successful. In fact, we've seen a spike in the numbers of illegal immigrants that have been coming onto our shores over the past 2 years. So, in practical terms, she hasn't been very successful at all. But what's interesting is that since she's been in power, despite a rise in arrivals, what we see in the polls is that people's concerns about immigration have gone down. So the impression is that for a lot of people, it's enough just to have in government someone that acknowledges that immigration is a problem and is at least seen as wanting to do something about it, rather than completely ignoring people's concerns.
Your thesis then, which is broadly that the apparent populist wave looks dramatic but won't be in reality, is partly based on the fact that if and when they reach government, they dilute their policies or they fit into the infrastructure as it already is. But you also have some broader observations about the actual structure of politics in Europe, about the parliament, and how hard it is to make change there. Talk us through that.
This isn't a right populist bloc. These are parties that have actually quite different policies on a number of issues. So I think there's that problem. That even if they had gotten a bigger majority, or even say an absolute majority, it's highly unlikely that they would have been able to actually translate this into working and acting as a bloc in terms of agenda setting. But more in general, I think there's a much more fundamental problem, and that is the fact that every time that these elections come along, we hear that these are crucial for the future of the European Union, and these will decide the next 5 years in the European Union. But the fact that kind of ignores the fact or assumes that the European Union is an actual democracy, an actual parliamentary democracy, where it is the actual outcome of the elections that determines the government. But that's not how things work in the European Union. I mean, the European Parliament itself isn't even a real parliament in the traditional liberal democratic understanding of the term, whereby parliaments are the institutions that initiate legislation. The European Parliament doesn't even have that kind of fundamental power. It can only accept or reject the candidates that are proposed by the European Commission. More in general, I mean, it's the European Commission that really initiates that sets the agenda. So von der Leyen has been the president for the past 5 years, supported by a kind of liberal centrist bloc, i.e., the centre-right. The biggest centre-right group in the parliament, the EPP, the biggest centre-left group in the parliament, the S&D group, and then the kind of liberal Renew Europe group. And that supermajority still exists even after these elections. So there's a very good chance that we're going to end up with another second von der Leyen term, which is pretty depressing.
Why is that depressing, Thomas? I know you've been quite critical of Ursula von der Leyen. What has she done wrong? What is it you don't like about her?
Well, first of all, she's completely disrupted what was an already a democratic imbalance that existed within the European Union, whereby this fundamentally unelected institution, the European Commission, largely decides for the fate of hundreds of millions of Europeans. She's further kind of tilted that balance towards the Commission by taking upon herself more and more powers that aren't even foreseen by the European treaties. In theory, the European Commission shouldn't even be in charge of of the foreign policy agenda of the European Union. But as I'm sure everyone, even in the US, has seen, von der Leyen essentially speaks on behalf of the European Union when it comes to fundamental, crucial foreign policy issues such as Israel and Gaza, or Ukraine and Russia, or NATO.
On something like immigration, which is probably the dominant issue, more than Ukraine, more than Israel, more than these foreign policy questions for many voters in Europe, von der Leyen has moved. She talks a tougher game in terms of controlling flows of immigration into Europe than was even thinkable 5 or 10 years ago. And you could make the case that this is democracy working. You get populist parties coming up. They then have to sort of dilute into the body politic, like Giorgia Meloni has done, and eventually they influence the president. And there's a tilt on policy. Why is this not democracy as it should be? This
Populist surge inevitably is having some impact on policy. So I mean, when we say that this is a very limited form of democracy that we have in the European Union, it doesn't mean that it's completely insulated from what's happening at the electoral level, at the democratic level. But again, these changes were already happening before the latest elections, and if we look at, for example, and it's just as much a fear of a populist insurgency happening outside the realm of politics. I mean, if we of kind of official institutionalized politics. If we look at, for example, at the way she's backtracked on the issue on the farmers, on the European Green Deal, and on the whole wave of green farming policies, which farmers have been protesting very vigorously about here in Europe. She's backtracked on those policies as well. So I would say that's more a question of political activism and political protests being effective, rather than the fact that the institutionalized democracy itself actually works that well. You could say some of the things I think about immigration, but of course, I mean, even these latest results are going to percolate to some extent into the policies.
Let me ask one final question then, which is, as an observer of across Europe, these different political trends, it's quite hard to get your head round looking at these results, because in some places, I'm thinking of Scandinavia, it looks like the populist parties are in retreat. In Spain and Portugal, they have not made the impact that you might expect. And even in Eastern Europe, Poland has turned away from the more right conservative group to Donald Tusk. Viktor Orban did not have a good night in Hungary. But Italy, Germany, France clearly have strong populist right components. What's going on? Why the difference? Or is it just it's a large, complicated continent and some people will be moving in different directions at all time? Can you draw it together into a single story for us?
Probably the most easiest way to draw it into one single story is to understand that these are all manifestations of what we could call the Euro or EU political cycle, which is one where you've got kind of moderate, liberal, boring centrist parties that come to power and essentially, implement policies that tend to be very unpopular, tend to make people worse off, tend to make people poorer, and that tends to engender a populist reaction, meaning that in a number of countries, the populists eventually come to power. This is what happened in Poland in recent years. This is what's happening in Italy at the moment. But once they get in power, what happens is that because of the constraints under which governments are forced to operate within the European Union, especially within the Euro, they're often unable to deliver on their electoral promises. They're unable to deliver the radical change that they had promised voters, which inevitably results in people turning back towards the kind of more liberal centrist parties, because now they're hoping that they might be the ones to deliver the change that the populists were not able to deliver. This might, I think, partially explain what's just happened in Poland. For example, I think it's what could happen in Italy in the next few years as people start to realize that Meloni hasn't really actually delivered on most issues. And I think so the question is that why we're seeing these different trends in different countries is because again, politics largely happens at the national level in Europe, and each country is at a different point of that political cycle. But I think much of what is happening in the various countries can be explained in terms of that political cycle. But of course, the question is that political cycle tends to get shorter and shorter. So the time that either populists or centrists are allowed to be in power before the people revolt tends to get shorter and shorter. And so at some point, that system is going to short circuit. At some point, people are going to realize that neither the centrists nor the populists seem to be able to deliver. And so the question then becomes, what comes next? What comes when people lose faith in kind of both the populists and the anti-populists? And I think that's something that we might find out pretty soon once these various populist parties come to power in a number of countries.
Front pages here are all about Europe's right turn. It's the hard right sweeps Europe. It's almost like the headlines were pre-written. And there's a bit of horror and maybe some titillation about that. Your message to people here in the UK or in the US who are watching is it didn't happen. Or what?
Look, I would say relax. I would say that both factions, both the liberal centrist faction that was saying, or still are saying, that this is a grave threat to democracy and that this is the last chance for democracy to survive, etc., as well as the populists, as many right-wing or right-leaning voters are now saying, hey, this is a great victory for democracy. This is really an important step forward in taking control back from the European oligarchy. I would say that they're both wrong. They're both, overblowing the importance of these elections because they, in order for democracy to be under threat, or in order for democracy to have been completely revitalized by these elections, we would actually need to have a functioning democracy in the European Union in the first place. And since we don't have that, I would say both factions are wrong. And so some would see that as a positive thing. I see that as more of a worrying thing. And I think it's going to be, a hard wake up for a lot of people in the next few months as they really come to terms with just how powerful the constraints to democracy still are in the European Union. And so my appeal to the populists would be, that's not something you can sweep under the carpet. While they try to reform it from within, they should never forget that the European Union itself is, I would say, a fundamentally unreformable, undemocratic institution.
Thomas, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Thomas Fazi, one of our favourite contributors, talking about Italy and the role on the wider European situation. What we haven't yet spoken about is Germany. It's, of course, the biggest economy in Europe, and it matters a lot. But right next door to it is Austria, and they've both had a bit of a rightward turn. We're joined by Ralph Schoellhammer, another favourite contributor of ours here at UnHerd. He is based in Vienna and has been paying close attention. Ralph, what's happened in the past few days?
Well, hi, Freddie. Thank you. It's great to be on with you. Well, this election was quite interesting in Austria because for the very first time, the populist right-wing Freedom Party came in first. So they did not just gain votes and, improve the results from recent elections. They actually became the strongest party. Not as much as they were hoping for, it is important to add. It's a little bit of a bittersweet success, if you want, because originally the polls predicted that they will get between 27 and 30% of the vote. They ended up with about 25.5% of the vote. It was still enough to get into first place, but not as significantly as they were hoping. And the reason why this is important is because Austria has federal elections in the fall. And there are huge expectations that the Freedom Party could be, after Giorgia Meloni in Italy, the second country in Europe, in Central Western Europe, where a right-wing populist could become the leader of government. Now, these hopes have now been dampened a little bit because these results were not as good as one would expect. But you're absolutely correct. This was yet another rightward shift in a Western Central European country.
So tell us a little bit more about the Freedom Party, because I remember during the COVID era, they really gained a lot of attention because they were against the lockdowns and against the stay-at-home orders. What's the history of that party in Austria?
Well, the Freedom Party really has a fascinating story for a right-wing party. It was originally founded by people who were members of the National Socialists and for a long time were excluded from participating in the political process. So originally, they were very much kind of a reactionary right-wing party, very similar to Marine Le Pen's father of the Front National in France. But they have shifted, right? Over time, they've taken a kind of more liberal stance in economic areas. They have taken a very strong pro-Israel stance. They have become a very Islam-critical party, but they always had a very strong populist streak. And as you correctly pointed out, this came really to the forefront during COVID, right? They were strongly against the lockdowns. They were strongly against the once announced, it never happened, I have to admit, the announcement of mandatory vaccines. So they kind of really became the protest vote also for the kind of, those who opposed measures during the pandemic, because originally their main policy was always being the anti-immigration party, which gave them a huge boost in 2015 during the migration crisis. But now they kind of added on to other populist areas. But it is important to say they have been in government before. It's a mixed record. They never made it through a full legislative period, but they have been the junior partner with the socialists in the 80s, and they have been the junior partner with the conservatives 2 times in the early 2000s. So this is a right-wing populist party that does have governing experience, but they never were the senior partner. So this is going to be interesting in the weeks and months to come.
Right, you say there was no mandate. We did a little report from Austria when there were stay-at-home orders for the unvaccinated, so there were definitely some quite what we would consider extreme policies going on. I guess that we are still paying the price politically for some of those. Just to finalise on the Freedom Party, because even in the name it is speaking about its philosophical viewpoint, would it belong closer to a Nigel Farage kind of reform party, which, as we discussed earlier, has more of a small government Thatcherite view, or would it be closer to Marine Le Pen, which is a little bit more interventionist, kind of a socialist style, lots of government spending, give out nice things to older people, that kind of thing? Where does the Freedom Party fit?
Currently, I would say it's closer to the position that you just mentioned of Le Pen. I mean, it's an interesting history. We probably could fill an entire hour with the story of the Freedom Party, because they were at one point a reactionary kind of leftover fascist party, then they were a truly economically liberal party, then they were a populist party, and as you correctly said, now kind of they are more like a Front National style party. So they have been a little bit like a chameleon and kind of shed their skin and changed their colors quite a bit over time. But it's important to know, I think, also for your viewers and listeners, both in Germany and Austria, with very few exceptions, very small parties, there is no truly economically liberal party, right? There are social liberal parties, but the idea that the government has to play a role in, kind of hedging in the excesses of the markets, that is deeply ingrained in public culture. So a truly free market Thatcherite party does not exist.
They may be called the Freedom Party, but they're not a libertarian party. Still, to conclude, it is quite historic then that Austria now has as its largest party, admittedly in European elections, but in these elections, what we would not very long ago have called a far-right party. And some people will no doubt be a little bit anxious about that, given what we know about the long history of that area. Let's go on to Germany. Again, there were big advances predicted at one point for the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD. They had a bit of a disastrous campaign, and yet they still managed to gain 6 seats in the European Parliament. What's the story of Germany's result?
Well, Germany's result is very interesting because, as you correctly pointed out, at one point about half a year ago, the AfD polled at around 22%. Then what happened was that a new populist party arose, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht. And Miss Wagenknecht, she was the member of the name of the party really was Die Linke, which translates to the left. And she, ironically, left the left and founded her own party that is economically very much to the left, but is socially more conservative. So and she calls it herself a left-wing conservative party. And she really kind of took a significant chunk out of the votes of the AfD. We can see this in the polls, right? As the AfD went down, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht went up. So that was really one of the main reasons why ultimately the AfD did not cross the 20% threshold. Also, as you correctly pointed out, they almost imploded shortly before the elections. It was this absurd scene where the main candidate of the AfD was banned by his own party from campaigning because he said a couple of justifiably so, I would argue, as his critics pointed out, stupid things in an interview with an Italian newspaper, where he made the point that not every member of the SS or the Waffen-SS was a criminal. Now, you can have a historical debate about this. I mean, this is, of course, more complex than you can say in an interview, but it should have been known to him during the interview that it is not a good look to appear as if you defend the SS, which probably was one of the worst institutions the world has ever seen.
We'll call that an understatement, Ralph. Understatement of the interview so far. Not a good look to defend the SS. So despite having made those kind of mega gaffes during the campaign and been, no doubt, outrage in the mainstream media, etc., they still score, 16% of the votes? That's not insignificant.
Oh no, it's not insignificant. And if you break down who actually voted for them, it's absolutely fascinating. They are now the leading party among 24 to 30-year-olds. So the youth vote is basically the AfD vote. They gained an additional 17% among young voters, whereas the Greens, they lost 23% among young voters. So if you want to ask the question, who is kind of the Gen Z party at the moment, it is more likely, or it would be more justified to call the AfD the Gen Z party than it would be to call the Greens the Gen Z party. And the other base of support is in Eastern Germany. That's absolutely clear. They are in all the areas, all the provinces of the former German Democratic Republic. The AfD came either in first or second. So they dominate these areas, and that's their power base.
I think we've got a map of that actually that we can put up. I mean, that is an extraordinary thing to look at. The fact that it's not roughly the East and roughly the West. It's literally a hard border of what the old Eastern so-called Democratic Republic was, is all pretty much all AfD now. What is the explanation for that? Why is it so clear and still so divided?
Well, I think the best explanation is, and I don't mean this derogatory towards these people, for whom I actually have a lot of respect, is that still the population in former East Germany feels somewhat left behind, right? Feels somewhat looked down upon, feels that they have no voice. It's a very similar demographic emotionally, I would argue, as, for example, Trump voters in the United States. And both the AfD, but also the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, they did a very good job in tapping into these feelings, which are, by the way, not entirely unjustified, right? There is this sense in Germany that West Germans, not all of them, but some they tend to look down upon the Eastern Germans, what they very often derogatorily call the Ossis, right? The kind of somewhat slightly retarded little brother, if you will. And of course, that left a mark. And this is what we see in those elections. And the other thing is that one of the reasons why it was always possible to keep right-wing populists in check in Western Germany was precisely this appeal to voter sentiment about the Third Reich, right? The idea was that any right-wing populist party, and sometimes this was true, sometimes it wasn't, is kind of too close, let's say, to the kind of attitudes that one would have found in fascist movements. But that argument doesn't work. That doesn't deter voters in East Germany, because they say, listen, after World War II, you guys got the better deal in the West. You were under American protection. You got capitalism. You got all the luxury goods and material wealth. We were more or less a puppet of the Soviet Union. So we suffered under communism. So they simply don't accept the idea that they are now called quasi-crypto-Nazis. So this kind of deterring people by blackmailing them via putting them in vicinity to Nazi ideology, that doesn't work in Eastern Germany in the way it does in Western Germany.
Going back to what you said just a moment ago about the young people, that really is just worth emphasizing, I think. It's extraordinary that young Germans are now voting for AfD over the Green Party. What is the explanation for that then? Because the Greens used to be the leaders among the young people. What has happened on the Green agenda that, well, they did terribly Europe-wide. I mean, they've lost more seats than almost any other bloc, but specifically in Germany, what do they do wrong?
It's a great question. By the way, just as a quick footnote, we see exactly the same in Austria. There it's the same. The Freedom Party is the most popular party among under 30-year-olds. And there is a couple of reasons, but I think the most important one is there is a slight mistake in the media, luckily a mistake that UnHerd does not make, that very often when we focus on the youth, we think about, or journalism very often thinks about young people that go to university, but they don't think about, for example, young people who already work, young people that that are learning a trade, so people that are not in the universities or high schools. And these people, of course, have had significant negative experiences with many of the policies of recent years, right? They go to schools where majority no longer speaks German. They compete very often directly with low-skilled labor. They feel that their neighborhoods are changing culturally and in other areas, right? So they are directly impacted, particularly by mass migration. And this is now resonating. Kind of the message of the right-wing parties is resonating with them. So when they say that housing is expensive because of migration, whether it's true or not, that's a separate question. But these issues are resonating. And another thing which poll after poll after poll is showing, which is fascinating, is that Gen Z, the older they get, they are actually becoming, I would not say more conservative, but they are becoming more patriotic, right? The idea of kind of a healthy relationship with your country of origin, that is becoming more popular among that generation. And that is the exact opposite of what, for example, the Green Party, if you will, is telling them, right? The Green Party is the kind of postmodern, post-nationalist party. This is no longer resonating with young people, or with a significant number of young people, let's put it that way.
Is it also the industrial story in Germany that partly because of green policies, shutting down nuclear, etc., the German industrial base is struggling? Is that something as well? Like literally, we've tried green policies and they haven't really worked.
I think there is that fear as well. This kind of fear of the future, I think, does definitely play a role as well. But I was surprised that the energy policy did not play as much a role in the campaign as I was thinking. It really was the two major issues were the war in Ukraine and immigration. Those kind of were also the two issues on which the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht and the AfD focused most of their energies on. And even though ultimately they did not get as much of the vote share that they were hoping for, they were not unsuccessful, because if you look at the traditional conservative party, like the Union parties, the Christian Democrats, they got an additional 1%. So this means that they didn't lose any votes compared to the last election, but they didn't really win any either. And that is remarkable, given how unpopular the current ample coalition actually is. So people then, they moved from the Greens, from the Socialists and from the Liberals, either to the non-voting bloc, to smaller parties, or to the AfD or the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, which is quite remarkable.
Final word on the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht. It's just an amazing story again. I mean, this is a party that's not even 2 years old, I think, and it's entirely based around one woman, and she left the Linke, the left-wing party, and it's this strange formula that we don't have really in the UK. I mean, there is an SDP that I think might be closest to it, but so far is not attracting much attention. And yet some other countries, if you look at Denmark as well, they've had a sort of centre-left party that has become really very strong on immigration. And it's a formula that many Western countries haven't tried. Sort of left-wing politics plus pretty firm and anti-immigration. Do you think that's a formula that we'll see in more countries?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It's fascinating. Actually, the party is not 2 years old, it's 6 months old, right? I mean, the rumors were around for a longer time, but the actual inaugurating event was 6 months ago. So out of nothing, 6% at a European election is quite impressive. But I think you're right. Although I would also add, it is a very specific German thing, right? This combination of the importance of the welfare state, the importance of welfare policies, of a strong social safety net, but at the same time being kind of culturally conservative, being anti-immigration, that is a very German/Austrian thing. So that does not surprise me that much. What makes it even more intriguing, I'm glad you mentioned this, is so you have the AfD, who are supposedly right-wing populists, and then you have the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, which are supposedly left-wing populists. But after the election yesterday, there was, a debate round with all the leading candidates of the parties. So you had Ms. Weidel, who leads the AfD, and Ms. Wagenknecht, who leads the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht. Everything they debated, all the issues they talked about, they basically were on the same page. So there are some differences if you dig deep into the party programs. But the major issues that people have on their minds, the war in Ukraine, inflation, fear of the future, immigration, those two parties basically have the same positions. And it's exactly what you say. It is this mixture of kind of a cultural conservatism, patriotism, with a rejection of mass immigration. And this is resonating. And I think we will see more of that in the future, in continental Europe at least.
And isolationism, potentially. I mean, you mentioned the war in Ukraine. Both of those parties are talking about trying to pull back a little bit from risking quite so much in the advancement of that campaign. Is that fair? How would you best characterize it? I no doubt some people watching will think it's defeatist, and maybe they're right. How should we understand that political trend?
I think you're correct, right? I mean, they officially their position is, which is fine, that they say they are for peace. But of course, we can ask, well, who is against peace? But their suggestions how to get to peace is more or less cease all support and all aid for Ukraine. And I think this is, of course, defeatist, I think is a strong word, but I think it's not entirely wrong, because this would potentially mean that Ukraine, that the defenses would crumble and that they can be overrun by Russia. And the idea that both the AfD and the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht have is one, that Germany should have more constructive, more positive relations with Russia, which is a position, once again, that does resonate with the German people. And why do we know this? We know it because there is a reason why Chancellor Scholz is so hesitant, or kind of is flip-flopping and going back and forth, right? And sometimes he's slow-walking aid for Ukraine, and then he's for it, and then against it, and then says that kind of weapons yes, but that kind of weapons no. Because he knows that even among what's left of the Social Democrats, right, the 15% that are still there, even they are not entirely fully behind support for Ukraine. Now, independently of what you and I think about this, right? But that's just the position as it unfolds in Germany.
So the map of Europe on that issue is also strange and different. So obviously the Eastern European countries that are closest to Russia tend to be very strong and very keen to maximize the defense of Ukraine. Hungary, I suppose, is the first Eastern country that is more hesitant on that. Meanwhile, the UK is absolutely diehard on it. We're possibly the most supportive of Ukraine's defense. But it's interesting that these more Central European countries are beginning to have as a legitimate political question to what extent that war must carry on forever.
Oh yeah, and they all have different political motivations as well. For example, the Hungarian example is a very interesting one. Right? There is very often the argument being made that the Hungarians are in the pockets of Putin or that they are pro-Putin. But I think that does not really explain Hungarian foreign policy. Hungary, throughout its history, which is also based, of course, in the fact, due to their language, they really are an island in Central Europe. They always perceived politics, they always perceived themselves to be surrounded by potential enemies, by potential oppressors, and therefore they need to chart a course as independently of anybody as possible. So there is a certain sense in Hungary, if everybody says do A, then they have kind of almost an instinctive reaction to do B. And if we ever have time to go deeper into Hungarian history, there are plenty of examples of this. The same, by the way, is true to a smaller extent with Poland. The Poland support for Ukraine is not so much driven by Polish sympathy for Ukraine, which is also there, but it's primarily driven also by Polish antipathy towards Russia. And by the way, interestingly enough, what we saw now in Poland with a new party that came up, the so-called Konfederacja, which immediately got 11% at these EU elections, they are much more critical when it comes to aid for Ukraine. So even there is a certain, let's say, the enthusiasm starts to decline. And the last point, which I think is also crucial in this, I'm sorry for going on so long, but I think it's a worthwhile point, is that the Germans have a sense that despite their very often violent history with Russia, that these violent episodes were always followed by rapprochement, right? By periods of either economic or political cooperation. So this is something that has been there historically for a very long time. But this is also something the Eastern Europeans fear, because the Poles know precisely what's happening if the Russians and the Germans get along too well. So these old kind of historical legacies, they still throw a very, very large shadow in Europe. But I think very often, particularly commentators across the Atlantic in the United States, they dismiss this too easily. But these historical memories are there, and they still impact politics today.
Very, very interesting. I'm going to ask you one final question. The headlines in the UK and in a lot of major international publications have all been about Europe's hard right turn or far right turn. Do you think that's true? Do you think Europe is becoming more right-wing?
I do think that is true. However, with kind of two caveats. One is this was a right-wing shift. I don't think it was kind of really a hard right-wing turn, because the big winner of this election was the European People's Party, which is the faction of European Parliament of the conservative parties. But many of the mainstream conservative parties in Europe have politically and ideologically significantly shifted to the left. Think, for example, about Angela Merkel in Germany, as mentioned before, very much pro-migration, anti-nuclear power, and so on and so on. So on paper, it seems like this was a vast shift to the right. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you see, okay, you had a shift to moderate conservatism that sympathize in many areas with the left. Think about, for example, Ursula von der Leyen. She's the conservative candidate, but she's also in support of, let's say, the Green New Deal, for example, or she participates in degrowth conferences in the European Parliament. So nobody's definition of a hardcore conservative, a hardcore right-winger. But yes, there was also an increase in votes for more identitarian right-wing parties. But I think this is just the beginning. This has not been the earthquake many were hoping for, but it's also not the end of it. So I think the next elections, both nationally and internationally, will be very interesting to observe.
Ralph Schoellhammer, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Our thanks to Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, Thomas Fazi and Ralph Schoellhammer for their fascinating and different insights. Let's try and conclude where we are. We actually did an analysis at UnHerd today, trying to work out how to make sense of this European picture. And if you add up the different populist parties that are now represented in the European Parliament, you can come up with a league table of populism. Which countries in Europe are going more populist and have big representation from populist parties, and which ones are not? And we put it on a map. Let's take a look. What you see is that top of the league table in Europe is still Hungary. 52% of its representatives in Europe are from the populist Fidesz party. And actually that underestimates the truth, which is that this new party might also be considered somewhat populist. Number 2 in the whole of Europe is now France, at 43% of its representatives from the populist parties. Right in third place, Italy at 42%. Then Poland, 38%, and then Austria, 30%. So that's really the big top 5. Numbers 6 and 7, though, you go straight over to the Netherlands and Belgium at 27% and 23%, before going to places like Latvia, Czech Republic, and Luxembourg. But that's really the big story, and it's quite clear when you see it put on a map that the center of Europe, the Iberian countries, Spain and Portugal, much less so. Scandinavia now, less so again. And the properly Eastern countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, there are not many populist representatives. But the big old powers at the center of Europe, the countries that really control the future of Europe, France, Italy, Poland, Hungary, Germany, and the Benelux countries, are increasingly and dramatically turning towards the populist right. Thanks to all 3 of our contributors today, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.